Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we are gonna look at a character design that I've been working on for the last couple weeks actually. And this is gonna be a bit of a walkthrough through the whole process, designing from a couple poses to the costume design, some color iteration, and even the final rendering. So in this video I'm gonna kind of talk through the whole process, talk about my kind of the mental space that I was in each stage and what I was thinking about, and and try to give some tips and tricks along the way. So this character is called Savannah. She's part of a world building project that I have going on my Patreon. So if you want to go support my work over there, I appreciate it very, very much. It's super motivating, and it's really nice to have people just, be behind my work and really supporting me. So so go check it out. This character, I have a bit of a backstory for her, but I won't go too deep into it. But basically, she's the daughter of a mechanic who creates these animal-like machines. And she's a bit of a rebellious, older teenager who just wants to get out and see the world. But she's kind of stuck in her father's garage working on these machines. So so basically I wanted to get some of those character traits out in the design, and the first thing that I start to think of is how I can use a pose or some sort of gesture to convey some of her attitude, some of that personality. So she's also supposed to be a bit laid back and a bit nonchalant. So this first pose is trying to convey that, just with a kind of contrapposto in her head, looking down, like she's not really caring about what's going on around her. But some of that is obviously left up to interpretation too by the viewer. So so in these first poses, I end up doing two poses to kind of design on top of. And what I'm really looking for in a pose is to get a nice balance in the pose. So I don't want the figure to feel too weighted on one side or the other, and just get some nice anatomy and a nice gesture down to build on top of, because this is really the structure of the design. And if this doesn't feel right, then it's really hard to build on top. So it's good to get those kind of main shapes and main flows, main rhythms working really well in the pose, so that when you come to design your costume on top, you've got a nice base to work on. So when I design costumes, a lot of the elements that I create kind of follow the anatomy in some way, or the lines, the gesture lines, and it helps kind of create flow in the costume and make it feel a bit more ergonomic. So building a good pose is really essential in that way. So this next one is a bit more dynamic, as you can see. So she's not standing still, but more in a walking motion. And so it's a bit off balance, a bit off kilter to be more dynamic, and is a bit more of an energetic pose, I guess. So with her head kind of tilted over to the side, and the kind of angle of the hips versus the shoulder, they're kind of angled in opposite directions. So that kind of helps give some dynamism to the pose and some action. So she's got that some attitude in her strut. So so the two poses have a bit of contrasting elements to them, so that kind of opens the door to different designs and conveying different feelings in the design. And so that's why I chose them, and I end up designing over both of them. Sometimes I'll just stick to one pose if I think that just better describes the character, but in this case I do some costume design over both of them, and then pick one in the end to render. So a little bit of liquefying just to fix some stuff. I'm really struggling with this back leg, so it's kind of going back into perspective, and just coming off the ground, and that's always like a tricky. I find it a tricky kind of angle to draw the limb, because like you don't really see the knee and how it's connecting to the calf and the foot and the ankle and stuff. So so I'm redrawing a lot of times just to get it right, or try to get it right. Now you can see I'm also bringing up the first pose to try to match the overall proportions of the character. So the character is supposed to be like pretty slender, pretty nimble. So I'm trying to get that kind of anatomy going, but I don't want the overall design to be too biased if I like one character's proportions over the other. So I'm kind of matching them to what I have in mind. Okay, so now we got the two poses ready. We are moving on to the costume design. So we have a pretty good foundation to work on top of, and now I'm just kind of sketching over the pose using that as a underlying structure, and just designing some costume elements. So as I said, she is the daughter of a mechanic and kind of works in a garage, so I'm giving her some functional elements, like some belts that can hold tools and stuff. And then I'm also using a bit of like ragtag clothing or stuff that's a bit more worn out, just to kind of show what the world has to offer. You know, in this world, I'm thinking of something post-apocalyptic. So, you know, there's no more designer clothing, or like really, there's no like new stuff that you can buy at a mall. It's mostly old, worn out clothing that you've looted from somewhere, or that your family's made, or that you've made from scratch. So you can see I'm kind of like beating things up and adding rips and tears, and that doesn't take away that the character might have a sense of fashion. So even if the clothing is old, the way the character kind of wears it and can, you know, influence how they kind of how they want to carry themselves. Like you can take rags and turn it into something fashionable if you just have the sense of fashion and the taste to do it. So yeah, just dressing her up. It's kind of like I do a little bit of paper dolling at this stage, that you'll see a little bit later, where because I'm working over one pose for at least two of the designs, I can kind of take elements from one design and try it on the other. And even though they might not work perfectly together, because I'm just drawing on one layer, and there's no kind of, I guess there's what you'd call like an alpha. So there's transparency to the line drawing. If I bring the line drawings from another layer over, it kind of, you can see both at once, and you can see if they work together or if they don't. And I often make little adjustments like this. So you saw that I kind of like scaled up the glove wrist, all the junk around her forearm, just to kind of accentuate the silhouette and make the design a bit more interesting. And also kind of like going over the anatomy once again, just to kind of refine the silhouette a little bit. In the costume design stage, I'm really thinking about like three things. I'm thinking about silhouette, I'm thinking about volume and kind of weight distribution. So what is visually heavy versus what is visually light, in terms of shapes. So you can see I'm kind of putting bulky elements like the gloves and the big tool belt, and then I'm also putting some more subtle skin tight elements like her shirt and her pants that kind of follow the forms of her body, and that contrast tends to make a really interesting design. So I'm thinking of how that what that balance is, if it's more skin tight, if it's more bulky, and then also and then the final thing I'm thinking about is detail distribution. So where am I putting most of the detail and where is the rest? Because it's really important to have a lot of both, or a good balance between both, I should say. Um, you want a clear hierarchy between your primary, secondary, and tertiary details. So I'm paying careful attention to where I place the rips and where I place the little buckles and straps and folds and all those little more intricate details so that it doesn't overwhelm the whole design, and just making sure that I'm keeping space for rest. So you can see I'm leaving quite a gap between like the rips on the top of her pants and the little rips on the bottom, so that your eye has a little bit of rest in between, and I'm not beating up the t-shirt too much, and I'm not putting it too much on her arms. I'm keeping all that detail down at the hands. And then things like boots and gloves and what's happening around the head. So at the tips of the limbs, I tend to add more detail, just because those are kind of the termination points. So your eye tends to flow out towards the end of the limbs, especially the hands and the head. And we tend to look at them a bit more. So focusing a little bit of more detail on that. And you can see I tried out something on the arm and figured it was kind of breaking up that rest a little bit too much. So I slid it down towards the wrist so that it's closer to the hand. And the head here, adding a lot of little intricate pieces of jewelry and a kind of flared out hairstyle, just to give her a bit of a rebellious look, I guess. It's a bit on the nose, but worth a try. So I don't think I end up going with this design, or I know I don't end up going with this design, but there's still some interesting ideas in there, and I tried to recycle a couple of them down the line. So now moving on to the second one, pretty much going through the same process of trying different costume elements and just trying to strike a balance and at the same time trying to uncover the character. So I don't have a super clear picture of what I have or what I want out of the character, or like a really clear image of the character in my mind, and I'm kind of discovering the character and kind of just uncovering her like bit by bit through this design process. So here you can see I'm striking a bit of a different weight balance. So I'm using kind of a bulkier design around the pants and still keeping that more skin tight shirt. So that like contrast in volume I'm trying to find like an interesting balance between that. You can say I'll even bulk up that transition in the hips, so that that kind of padding, you'll see I'm kind of wrapping it higher up around the hips so that there's more contrast in the silhouette. And and then adding little bits of detail and stuff. I tend to do like only pretty much 2 passes on my drawing. I kind of sketch out a main idea and then I go in with a second pass just to clean up the lines, and try not to redraw things too much. So if I don't nail it the first or second time, I just kind of like put it to the side and try something else. So trying out some hard surface stuff, trying not to kind of fall victim to just adding stuff because it looks cool, but trying to keep it functional. So you'll see that I don't end up going with those shoulder pads because I don't think they actually function in any way. And also the shoulder pads felt a little bit square. So I try angling them, but still it kind of adds a little bit too much bulk around her shoulders. So again, adding some gloves just to bring more detail down by the hands. I think I bulk these up too. A part of the balance I try to strike as an artist between like my stylized or stylization and the realism in my designs is is something I struggle with in every drawing, and I kind of try to scale things up to add a little bit more interest to the silhouette. And yeah, when I'm drawing or I tend to draw things pretty realistically at first, and that's not always great because like realism can be a bit flat, which is why, you know, in stylization we exaggerate things, we exaggerate shapes and forms and stuff. So I'm trying to exaggerate a little bit more than what you'd find in reality, just to keep it interesting. So this is another strategy that I can use when I'm designing, because I'm pretty much designing everything using line art. So I can just hide a layer, and now I want a second layer to the costume. So on another layer I can just draw like I guess the jacket or the sweater that I want on top, and then I can bring back that first costume layer and see if they go well together, and I can even bring the jacket over to the previous design I worked on to see if they work well together. And if they do, then I just kind of erase out what the jacket would be hiding in the design, and then I can, you know, combine them basically. So here I wanted something kind of a bit, just something that would break the silhouette up a little bit more, and again just provide more contrast between what is loose and heavy and what is skin tight, and also adding something to kind of describe her nonchalantness. I don't know if that's a word, but so yeah, kind of just a loose sweatshirt that she wears around the shop. Maybe it's a little chilly, but not really chilly enough to actually wear it over her shoulder because yeah. So and then just, you know, adding some little design elements so that it's not just like a generic hoodie. Often in character design, if I'm really just designing to design, which is what I'm doing now, I'm not necessarily designing to illustrate. I'll often copy over facial features so that I don't need to redraw a portrait every single time. Sometimes I do want to experiment a bit with different portraits and different facial features, but I'm keeping this one pretty generic. And if I want to do something more unique, then in the rendering stage I'll kind of change the features around and kind of model the face to what I'm looking for. You can also see that I'm keeping the base body in low opacity underneath the whole costume design, and that's just so that I'm aware that there's a kind of mannequin under everything. So it's important to keep that structure under so that I don't accidentally start cutting into the body basically without by like ignoring that there's actually a body underneath, which is a mistake I see a lot of beginners do. They kind of forget that the costume is on top of a body. So when you look at the end, like the end result, the whole thing kind of looks mushy, like the body's spaghetti underneath the costume, and it's because they've cut in certain areas and they've kind of ignored that, you know, you have joints and bones and muscles in certain areas. So I'm just kind of keeping those poses really light under the whole thing until I start rendering basically, or until I start doing the color blocking, so that I don't accidentally miss it. So now I'm moving on to the second pose, or I guess the first pose that I worked on, but the other pose. And when I started drawing this one, it immediately felt, I guess, more right. Like it just felt better. It felt more like the character, and I was getting better feedback, I guess, from the drawing. And yeah, just like immediately after drawing those big bulky gloves and that more skin tight jumpsuit with those cuts, I could already like see the sort of the final character. So you can see I'm quickly sketching in those big knee pads with the big boots, and yeah, I kind of see the silhouette. I see the character design right off the bat, and yeah, and this is actually the design that I end up going with. So I think even in the time lapse, if you were to kind of calculate how long I spend on each sketch, I think this is the sketch I spend the least amount of time on. And I think that's just because I had, a better vision of what I wanted to do. But in any case, you can see I'm adding, again, contrasting elements. So big bulky knee pads, big bulky gloves, and then, more skin tight boots and the jumpsuit underneath. And I think I layer on like a belt as well, like a tool belt, just to kind of break up the design at the hips a little bit. So here I draw in all the laces, and I know it's going to be noisy, so I just end up erasing the whole thing. And also just for the simplicity of the design, it's kind of nice to, it just wasn't something I wanted to have, so I kind of simplified it down to just having like a zipper, and here bringing back some elements of the other design just to create that tool belt. Over the years, I've experimented with a lot of different ways of designing, like like the actual technique that I use in this design stage, in this costume design stage, and I found that just drawing with lines, like line art, instead of drawing with shapes or painting or all that, it just keeps it really just intentional and kind of cuts out all the stuff that you shouldn't really be thinking about at this stage. Like, I'm not thinking about color, I'm not thinking about light or rendering, I'm not thinking about really like tertiary details or even materials that much. I'm kind of just thinking about shapes and the kind of delineation of where things start and where things end. I'm thinking about just hard surface versus soft surface, what's going to be fabric and what's going to be plastic or metal or skin, what's going to be organic versus what's synthetic, and just kind of balancing those ingredients. Or if you kind of design with color and painting and lighting and all that stuff all at once, I find it really overwhelming, and I find that my designs suffer quite a bit, because I'm trying to think about too many things at once. But that's just me. There are amazing designers out there that design straight in color. They just paint and kind of uncover the design as they're illustrating. And this one, I can't really copy over the facial features, so I'm kind of redrawing the portrait and fiddling around with it a little bit. And now I'm just kind of tweaking stuff, line weight, and just making sure that the three designs are consistent. When you're presenting your work to an art director, for example, or if you're looking to get feedback, it's important to try to get like a non-biased feedback. So I've just made a point to try to be really consistent in the way I present work. So, the line weight is the same. The strategy for drawing is the same for the three designs. I'm trying to reuse some elements, like the pose or the shape language, or even, props like this, so that if I'm working for a client, for example, they wouldn't say like, oh, I like this design just because I like this wrench that she's holding, or I like this pose more, or I like the way you drew this more. Um, I try to keep that really, really consistent, I guess. So, and not that I don't really work for a lot of clients anymore. But as a designer, I also need to judge my designs in the least biased way possible. So I try to keep that consistent. Okay, so here we're moving on to masking and shading. So this is kind of a bit of a boring part to mask things out. I actually end up shading most of this first character before even masking it. But in any case, masking out the silhouette is probably one of the most important parts for everything down the line at this point. So shading and color iterations and variations and rendering and all that. So just to have a really clean mask can kind of make or break the presentation of the character. So how clean your presentation looks can kind of depends if you did a nice mask or not. Here I'm just kind of shading just because I was excited to start, and I think after I get almost through this whole character, then I decide to like, okay, I should probably mask out these silhouettes so that I don't need to think about erasing out and cleaning up the drawings outside the character, and it just gives me a better read on the whole design. But in any case, so for this shading stage, I'm using a pretty simple light strategy. So I'm using a light that's pretty central and illuminates the figure pretty evenly. So I'm kind of using one light source from the center a little bit off to one side, which is, you can see it pretty clearly on the face. It's kind of like directly in the center of her forehead, or even on her body, you can see the light source is coming from the front. And so the shadows kind of wrap around the form, and then I'm using like a rim light, or sometimes I don't use a rim light, but just to pick out the silhouette. So you can see on the arm on the far right now before I flip the canvas. So there's a rim light like on her shoulder, and that kind of helps just bring a bit of contrast to the silhouette. And if you were to have a dark background, it kind of like it kind of makes the silhouette pop. Rim lights are also a good way of showing the material. So materials that are glossier or have lower roughness tend to have more Fresnel reflections, basically. So Fresnel reflections are the reflections that kind of happen as the form is turning away from the viewer, from the camera. And so basically around the edges, you'll get more reflections. And so for glossier materials, you'll get kind of like, you'll almost always get like a sort of rim light if you have a light background. If you have a dark background, the Fresnel reflections will be dark. So it'll kind of like melt into the background that way. But in any case, for the shading, I'm just trying to describe the form. So I'm using a simple kind of lighting solution, and just trying to like get my main planes organized so that I know kind of what's facing what direction and how the volumes are interacting with each other. So basically describing the form shadows and the cast shadows as well as possible, at least like in the plotting stage of it. I'll refine all of this when I go to render it, but yeah, this is kind of just like planning out what I'm gonna render, and planning out the forms and making sure that all those overlaps work well. I find that shading and design, if you shade it well, it can really, really bring it to life. And if you don't shade it well, then it can kind of like kill the design because it just feels flat and boring when you thought that it would, you're trying to render some level of like realism or some fidelity to real life, or to 3D-ness, or to the 3D form. So if your rendering kind of falls short of that expectation, then it kind of flattens out your design and kind of makes it less appealing than it could be. So it's good practice to kind of just render simple forms, and try to make them look really, really 3D. So that when you get to more complex stuff like these characters where there's anatomy involved, and hard and soft surfaces, and all these like overlaps and intricacies, it's a lot more approachable. So here I'm finally masking things out, so just going around with a hard brush to just outline the silhouette, and then I'll select the background and invert the selection to fill everything else. And that's just so that I have kind of full control over the outline of the silhouette. And if I need to refine anything, then I can just like go in and erase it or brush it out. If I were to select the background just with like the magic wand tool and invert the selection, then I'd probably get a whole bunch of artifacts due to the fuzziness of the line art. So I know in other programs you can, like Paint, I think it's Paint Tool Sci or Clip Studio or whatever, they have different ways of filling stuff, and you can set auto smoothing and feathering and all this stuff. But I just prefer to have 100% control over the silhouette, because this is going to be like the final silhouette, like the final mask of the design. So I just want to make sure that's really clean from the get-go, and then I don't have to really retouch it later unless I make global changes to the final rendering, which I can do just by merging everything and liquefying it, or warping it with the transform tool. The hair is always the most tricky part, because hair is soft in nature. So putting a hard outline on it is going to be, it's always a little bit hard or tricky. And now I need to come in and cut out some stuff that I accidentally filled, and that's it. So filling only takes 10 or 15 minutes, or masking I should say, and as you can see, it just like it immediately cleans up the drawing. So I just clip the shading layer to that mask and make the mask white. So the mask is under everything. You can see the it's currently locked so that I don't actually accidentally paint on it. And then I clip my shading, and I'll also clip my colors and all that to that mask, and that'll just prevent me from drawing outside the lines. So here, just cleaning up some rendering, or trying to define those materials a bit better. Now I'm moving on to the second one. So you can see I can use a bigger brush and do kind of bigger kind of global shading without going outside the silhouette, and so I can cover a bit more ground that way. And something I try to remind myself is to shade from biggest to smallest. So render your big forms, so the kind of like the whole sphere of the head, and then you kind of go in and render out the smaller forms inside. So the socket of the eyes and the eyelids and the curvature of the nose and the lips and that sort of stuff. So you kind of render the primary form first, and then you kind of go in and sculpt the inner forms, the kind of surface forms. Which is not what I'm doing here. for the torso. I'm kind of directly going in and rendering those secondary forms, like the anatomy and the shirt and stuff. But it is better practice to kind of do the global stuff first and then the secondary stuff. Because if you do the secondary stuff like I'm doing on the sleeve, right now that sleeve looks really flat because there's no kind of global form to it. Or the primary forms aren't there. So I need to go in after and kind of darken that crease like in between the arm and the body, and then I'll need to darken the outside as well, just so that the whole sleeve feels cylindrical instead of a like a flat plane with folds. And yeah, I mean, like I've rendered hundreds, if not thousands of drawings, so like I still know that in the end I'm gonna need to go back in and kind of push and pull those big shapes. So like I'm doing here, I'm kind of, you know, knocking back the pouch and knocking back knocking back the left side of the belt, so that it's turned away from the light, or it feels more turned away from the light. But you can see on the pants, this is like much better practice where I'm actually, you know, sculpting those primary shapes first, kind of laying a general foundation of light and shadow, and now on top I'm kind of sculpting those secondary forms. So I'm sculpting the ripples and the folds, and then, you know, going in with the kind of tertiary forms with the little seams and the smaller folds and those kind of smaller nuances in the form. So you can kind of see the difference between how the pants look like quite a bit more 3D than the sleeves on this character, just because I did that global shading. So the sleeves kind of feel flat and the pants feel more three-dimensional, even if the pants are a little bit more soft, I guess, in shading, like they don't have really tight rendering on them. And then for like the shoes, they have a bit of a nicer balance, I guess, where there's some nice global shading, and then I came in and tightened up the details. I'm also trying to only render the form and not the local value of whatever part of the design I'm working on. So example, if the t-shirt were to be a black t-shirt, I'm not rendering the black t-shirt, I'm just rendering the form of the t-shirt, because in the color stage I'll make the t-shirt black and all those shadows will still work, because the 3Dness, like the form, is separate from the color. They're like two different elements, I guess. So right now I'm only rendering form. I'm not rendering value, or local value. So obviously I'm laying down different shades of gray, but I'm mostly like laying down form and a little bit of materiality. So like this hair is going to be glossier. So glossier things will tend to be darker with a sharper highlight. And then matter things, if you're only rendering the form, will tend to have a more washed out highlight. So they'll be a little bit lighter, or a little bit more, I don't know how to describe it without just saying it's more matte. But they'll have like softer transitions between light and shadow, and glossier things will have more high contrast. And then if it's glossy and metallic, then it'll have the most contrast. So metallics will go almost all the way to black and almost to full white. Um, so I am touching a little bit on that, but for the most part, I'm just kind of rendering a sort of mid rough, like a mid, um, I don't know how to say it, like a mid roughness material on everything. Almost like the whole thing is just made out of the same white material. And here, now that I have those general shadows, I can come in with those secondary folds and the little details on the belt, kind of separate those elements out, the bit of ambient occlusion, and rendering out the tension folds and the little secondary shapes. So as I'm working through this, I'm not actually using any reference. Um, I don't think I only used reference really in the rendering stage, where I got some reference for the materials that I was trying to describe. So I got specific references for like the kind of rubber and the kind of metals and the kind of, um, I think the portrait, like skin tone and kind of makeup. Um, but that's pretty much it. Like in the design process and in the shading process, I didn't use any references. And that's kind of, I mean, I've drawn a lot of this stuff in the past. You know, as like a professional concept artist, I'm drawing clothing and stuff almost every day, and I've been doing it for years. So I know how to draw a t-shirt and pants. But yeah, so it is really important to use reference if you don't know what you're drawing, or if you haven't drawn your subject a lot of times. But in the design process, it's important to kind of balance your own intuition and your own design sensibilities with the use of reference. So something that I've heard a lot before is kind of using a reference sandwich. So kind of using reference at the beginning and at the end of your process, but not in the middle, or you use it in the middle, but not at the beginning and the end. And that kind of allows you to take in information from your reference and kind of build a visual library for your project. And then as you're designing, you kind of are relying a bit more on your own sensibilities as an artist or as a designer. And then you can come back to reference if you need something specific for rendering, or to add that extra little level of believability in your designs. So these little cuts and stuff, or this is just for presentation. I think I was just preparing this to post on Patreon. So kind of showing what's the skin and what's the costume. And this is also kind of, just planning for me for this next stage, which is the color blocking. So this stage might get a little bit repetitive. So I don't know, if you're getting bored, you can feel free to skip to the end of this chapter and just see the end result. But basically what I'm doing here is trying out colors. So I'm using a pencil tool to kind of mask in and create non-anti-aliased masks for every different color. So this is something a lot of comic artists use just to do to mask out all the different colors in a panel. Well, I'm just doing this to mask out all the different colors in the costume. So for this character, I'm kind of using a function-driven color strategy. So what that means is color isn't an independent thing from the design. It's driven by the materials and it's driven by the functionality of the design. So even though I try out different color schemes, I end up going with the one that's the most functional, I guess. So, the colors represent the materials and they represent the kind of manufacturing process and all that. So, for example, if I'm using rubber, I'll probably use like a dark gray or some version of that and not make the rubber bright yellow, just because in this world, the materials are pretty raw and pretty, they're not processed too much. And if they are, they're probably materials from the past or from like a long lineage of plastics and stuff that just haven't degraded, so they keep their color, I guess. But all that to say, I'm trying to find some colors that describe the character well, and trying to find like a nice balance in contrast and in value and hue, and so I guess I'll just walk you through a little bit what I was thinking and for this, as I'm like shifting all these hue and saturation sliders around. But I was basically thinking one of two strategies, either going really poppy and bright or doing something a bit more conservative. So you can see I'm trying out some yellows and oranges and trying to make it contrast with something dark. And for some other designs, I'm trying to just keep it a little bit more monochromatic or a little bit more analogous, so that there's less contrast overall. And I'm also kind of paying really specific attention to like warm and cool colors. So I want a little bit of one and more of the other, so that there's some sort of hierarchy. So if it's dominantly predominantly cool, then I'll just use a pop of warm colors, so something like yellow, orange, or red, as like an accent color. So in this case here, it's like a little pop of yellow and mostly green, or a little pop of orange and mostly green. And then if I want something warmer, then I'll use predominantly a warm color and then use a little pop of cool color just to bring kind of balance to the whole design. So here, I'm making a bright red or bright orange suit, and then I'm really cooling down all the padding so that it's more cool in comparison or in contrast to the red. And you can see sometimes I even hide the shading just so I can look at the flats and see if the flats are working on their own. And then finally, like the last kind of thing I'm tweaking is just the overall values. So this is also giving me a pretty good idea of what materials I want to use for the final design. And so I'm trying to keep those values in check. So here, redlining and revisions. This is something that if you work professionally, you'll probably run into one day. Sometimes your lead or your manager will come in and put notes on your drawing for changes. Sometimes it'll be the art director, or sometimes it'll just be like a senior member of your team who comes in and does this. And this is basically, I'm just coming back with fresh eyes after a couple days of not working on this character, and I'm immediately seeing some stuff that I want to address or I want to change. They're not huge changes to the design, but I'm just seeing some places that might that could use maybe a couple more cut lines or some more details or some more functionality. So you can see I'm adding a zipper to the front of her suit, just so that if she needs to take it off, it's not like some whole it's not like some really complicated process, because it's basically like a full body suit, and if you don't have a zipper, then it's like borderline impossible to get out of. And then you can see I'm adding some like machined holes with some what do you call it, like some hardware basically to hold the plastic the plastic parts of the gloves down. So they're kind of bolted into the glove, and it kind of adds a bit of a more industrial touch. And then here I'm adding some more functional elements, so some belts to hold that tool belt, and some headphones, some like soundproofing or noise canceling headphones, so that she can work in peace in the garage. So it's also kind of a like it's kind of pulling on the iconography of like a teenager and their headphones, or like their Walkman or their MP3, just kind of having that on them. It's kind of that a bit of symbolism to show like her sense of escapism, or that she wants to kind of get away in a way. Maybe not run away, but just kind of be in her own space. So it might not come off like that immediately, but those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when I'm adding these props. So they are functional, but they might also symbolize something about her character, you know. So yeah, now I'm actually modifying the actual drawing. So I think I duplicate the whole group so that I just have a backup, and I'm reworking the line art. So going back to the foundation, and just, you know, adding some details. I try, you know, some stuff, you know, like those cut lines on her torso, and it was a little bit too much, so I just knocked it back a little bit, and yeah, just kind of doing a once over the whole design to make sure that the final design is what I want and what I like. Pushing the shapes a little bit, bringing some secondary elements into the silhouette, you know, just to break things up and make it more visually interesting. And doing just a final pass, like quintuple checking everything before I go and render it, because once I start rendering, I don't want to be fighting with my line art. I just want to kind of go in and think about lighting and materials and stuff. So just making really, really sure that my line art is in the stage where I want it. Bulking up some of the elements too. I'm working on trying to show a bit less restraint in my designs. Like, I don't think it's fear necessarily, but I'm trying to push the shapes a little bit more in my personal work. I think just from my studio work, I'm developing certain habits for designing characters that I might not want from my personal work, just because it's a super realistic project. And, you know, I like the stylized stuff. I like the stylized shapes. So yeah, in my personal work, I try to be conscious of that and try to push everything a little bit more than I normally would. And also little so basically the padding she's wearing is to do her garage work. So you know, to slide under the machine and to get in awkward places. And the machines they build are basically like giant animal tanks or tank animals. So, you know, you don't want to be like hitting your elbows and knees and stuff against metal panelings, and get Charlie horsed and hit your funny bone every other minute. So that's basically why she has the padded elements in her costumes. But also something important in big garages and even like manufacturing plants is just like some high visibility elements. So you'll see often people working on machinery in shops and plants that they'll have some sort of like high visibility vest or maybe some retro reflective bands on their arms or helmet, just so that people are aware that they're in kind of in a kind of dangerous spot. If the machine starts moving, you don't want to get crushed, or you don't want to just get mangled up by whatever gears, or if somebody turns on the electrical current and you're playing with wires, you don't want to get electrocuted. So all this stuff. But so that's why I decided to introduce like a couple high visibility strips on her gloves and knee pads, just so that if she happens to be in like under a machine or something, somebody doesn't actually accidentally power it on, or they see that she's actually there. So all that to say, I'm just adding in some elements for functionality and for a bit of storytelling. And then doing some final color adjustments. So this final color scheme I decided to go for is as you can see a complementary color scheme with a bit of this like bright green yellow accent. So the orange and blue are complementary, and then I'm using some neutral grays to kind of fill out the rest. So the really dark fabric that makes up the tool belt and the back of the knee pads, and then the gray rubber parts of her jumpsuit. Those are kind of just to kind of bridge the gap between the cool and warm colors. And then those small accent colors, so the bright yellow and then the little strips of bright red, or they're kind of like pretty neutral, but of red on the tool belt. Those are just to kind of add little spots of color interest. And now I'm kind of describing the materials a bit better. So the fabric is going to be a little bit worn and it has lost a bit of its color, so it's a little bit lighter. And then those darker dark grays are the dark plastic bits. So plastic, depending if it's molded or if it's I don't know how, like plastic can be manufactured different ways basically, but often they'll have the pigment in the plastic as it's molded, so it's not painted on top. So the resins or the polymer is colored a certain way, so as it wears, it doesn't really change color that much. So the plastic's basically darker, remains darker even with time. So a little trick here for the organic, so her skin, hair, and the portrait, I'm separating onto another layer. Organic materials tend not to have sharp corners or sharp transitions, so I'm kind of using a soft brush to lay in some color, some color variation in the skin and in the hair, and kind of soften those transitions so that when I go to render, I'm not fighting with a hard edge. Now we move to rendering, the final stage. Woohoo! So after a lot of work, I think I'm at least 7 hours in, or 8 hours in at this point. I'd have to double check, but I think this whole process took about between like 10 and 12 hours. The video is sped up at 10 times, by the way, so just make the video, or like multiply the length of this whole video by 10. But basically all this work that I've put in so far is to kind of prepare for the stage. So basically the final presentation of the character. So for this rendering process, I'm using a pretty a bit more of like a studio workflow, so it's less it's much more methodical. I'm kind of rendering out the grayscale, and then I already have the colors on overlay, so if once I get the basic rendering of the materials, I can just bring back the colors and already have a really solid foundation for the color, as you can see. And then you can see I'm painting on the black and white layer on the very bottom, which is also my mask. And because my colors are set to overlay, I can make some hue and value changes on that mask that'll show up on the top layer. So you can see I added some like highlights to kind of give some glossiness to the rubber, or even some highlights to the retro reflective parts, and they show up because of the blending mode, because of the way the layer stack is set up. And I can use some texture brushes and try to bring out some different properties of the materials. You can see here because the skin's set on another layer, it's still set to normal, so I'm kind of shuffling around my layers so that the skin is also blending down to my shading. And I'm also just doing a once over everything since I reviewed some of the design. So just making sure that the final shading really describes the form well, and that I don't get too many shading artifacts or splotches, or because I drew outside the lines, or I'm not shading the right part. So just polishing basically at this point. This is a stage I can really kind of get lost in a good way. I can just get into like a flow and work on something, and I don't really think about how long I'm spending on it at this point. I just kind of render stuff until I'm happy, and over time, I've gotten a bit faster, but the important part right here is just that the result is nice. So if you need to spend 20 hours or 40 hours on it, if you can afford the time, then do it. Over time you get better and you get faster. But it's whatever time you have to make it look as pretty as possible. So here I'm adding a bit of a rim light just to pick up that edge of the silhouette. And you can see every time I make some changes, I'm double checking with those color flats. So I kind of bring the flat layer back and make sure that I didn't go too bright or too dark. Because if I go too bright with this layer stack, the light in the value, like in that mask, the brightest parts of that layer are going to wash out the color on top, and the really dark spots are going to burn the dark spots. So that's just like something you have to deal with when you're dealing with layer stacks and blending modes and stuff, is you have to work in a certain value range, and there are pros and cons of working with different layer styles and different blend modes and organizing your layers in certain ways. I'm basically just doing this so that I can get a really good value structure, and then I have my flat layer that will give me a good color base. And then on top of everything, once I'm happy with the base, I'll just duplicate and merge everything and then just paint using like a normal layer and polish the whole thing up. So I'm pushing the highlights, the ambient occlusion, showing some reflections, really pushing some of the materials that are more matte or more glossy. So you can see it's starting to kind of look like a 3D render, but like a 3D grayscale render. So if you were to make all your materials 50% gray and just make them glossy or metallic, it would kind of look like this, So a little trick for just value range, because I'm dealing with a pretty compressed value range, I only need to go lighter than 50 or like 50% gray is kind of my mid-tone. That's what the background color is set to. And you'll only need to really go lighter than that if the material's glossy or glossy and metallic. So if the material's really matte, like if it's fabric or if it's just like a really matte rough plastic or something, or even skin, I don't really need to go higher than that. I only need the shadows to just describe the form. So I need to be careful, with it, especially for like skin and in the focal points. If I go too light, you can see that like in her forehead, it's kind of like blowing out the color of the skin. So I'll need to kind of bring that back and kind of reshape and bring a bit more life back into that area when I go to paint over the whole thing. But you can see it's working, like the highlights are working really well on the rubber on like her torso and her elbow pads and stuff, to show how like it's kind of like a glossy rubber material but still has some roughness breakup in it. So here you can see I duplicated and merged everything. So this is like my paint over layer, and I'm just working in normal mode, kind of going at it just the old-fashioned way, just color picking and painting over. I'm still using a soft brush because that's just the way I like to paint, but doing it this way I can reshape anything I want. So if there's part of the form that I don't like, I can just remodel it. If there's some colors that I don't like, I can just glaze over it and change the hue or the warmth of the color if I want to bring some warm tones or some cool tones. And I can really sculpt the final illustration. So I especially like doing this for portraits because I know often I need to retouch stuff and to kind of remodel parts of the face. I rarely nail a portrait on the first go, so I think this is probably like the 5th time that I retouched this portrait. So doing it just on another, like on a merged layer in normal mode, it just allows me the most flexibility. So I'm not fighting with any of my other layers. Not to say that it's not difficult. Like it is really challenging to paint like straight in color, because you need to be also thinking about value and lighting and all this stuff. But since I have a really good foundation from the other steps I took, then this is then it's much more approachable. So now I'm really in the polishing stage. So I'm kind of making some just small tweaks a little bit everywhere, adding some tertiary details in, just some general sharpness to the design. So because I work with a soft brush, sometimes I'll get fuzzy edges, and at this point I'm kind of just tightening everything up, so making sure that that everything's reading well and sharp, especially on the hard surface stuff. I don't want too many fuzzy edges, so sometimes I'll use the lasso tool to kind of like make a clean selection and bring out some edges. And I'm also adding kind of last like finishing touches for texture and wear and stuff. So you can see I'm doing a big mud/grease pass on everything, just to add some age to her outfit. This just gave me, as I was working on this gave me flashbacks from working in a bike shop when I was in high school and in university. I used to be a mechanic, so I remember coming out of there like just so greasy and gritty, just oil and bike grease and like not the soot, but like the dirt that you get on bikes that haven't been cleaned, or like it just gets in your pores and in every crevice, and it's really hard to clean out. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get in here with those that texture is kind of like the dirt that is impossible to clean. And here I'm doing I'm creating a texture basically for the fabric elements. So her suit has yeah, so you can see where I'm putting this texture, that's going to be like a more porous fabric, so a more breathable fabric just around the areas that need to move. So that, you know, as she's moving around, there's no like pinching or whatever in the suit. And so I can just set that to a blending mode and just blend it in. It's super subtle, and you can barely see it on the final result, but it's just a nice little detail if you zoom in and take a look. Now I can add little details like tread and texture and all the little touches, and you can see here, like, I can make these global changes using Liquify if I need to change some stuff in the forms. And just a nice little perk of working with the masks is that I can use those masks to still do selections and stuff. So you can see I went into my layer to select the skin so that I could make some changes. I wouldn't be able to do that if I were to just render, basically, if I didn't have any masks, or if I didn't go through that process of masking and doing the color blocking and stuff. And here I'm using a color dodge layer. So this layer is filled with black and it's layer locked. And if I add white into it, then it kind of creates more shiny looking highlights. So I'm just using that just to bring out some final little details in the form, really small folds, really small subtle form changes in the anatomy. And this is, yeah, just keep on polishing. Every time I think I'm done, I take a 5-minute break, and then I come back and I see what stuff I can fix, and I just keep working at it. And I think that's it makes a huge difference to just I guess not to not be satisfied with your result, but just to continuously seek improvement. Even if you need to take a break and be patient. I have a bad habit I had a really bad habit of trying to wrap up a piece in one day, and often the piece kind of fell short of what it actually could have been if I just took a break and came back to it. And even, you know, with an extra hour, just make small fixes and just push it a little bit more. But, you know, over time I realized that I can be more patient. I worked on this character over multiple sessions, and I think those multiple sessions really helped actually push the design further than it was at the start. You know, even with the redlining and the redesign, not the redesign stage, but just doing the revisions on the design really helped to show the functionality and to add more believability to the design. And then coming back and rendering this over multiple stages just to, you know, add some storytelling elements, like these really subtle tattoos, and, you know, just the final touches and stuff. It makes a big difference. So as usual, I'm kind of, you know, presenting this character on a white background, so I'm making sure that the silhouette, especially in the hair, that it reads well in a light background, since the hair has has transparency and softness to it. I just want it to be nice and clean. And now I'm kind of, I think this is probably my 4th session coming back to it, but I'm just making these final little tweaks. It's never too late to change a design element. So here I'm, painting in a bit of hair on that far side just to frame her face a bit more. And I think that helped quite a bit. Touching up the portrait again. Trying to figure out the gaze. So the gaze is probably one of the most important thing in a character, in a portrait. So just where the character's looking and how they're looking can describe a lot about their character and their personality. And here I'm designing the, I guess the family crest. So the if you're on my Patreon, then you'll know that the machines are called gazelles. So this is kind of just like a logo. It's just a bit of a an Easter egg, I guess, but something really subtle. So this is part of their business of creating these machines. And it's just a bit of iconography, a bit of symbolism to add some storytelling to the character. And I think that's about wrapping it up. So I think in a moment here we might fade to black, and these are the final images. So sketch, shading, color, and the final render. So thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around. I hope you guys learned something in the process, and I'll see you guys in the next video.